You're listening to the Mind Flipping Podcast, where you'll find tools and tips to help you renovate and update your mind and life.
Mark, thanks so much for being on the Mind Flipping Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, super excited to have you. For our listeners that aren't aware, actually, I may end up putting this in the intro, that Dr. Edith Ubuntu Chan introduced us. And it started with, I had asked her, where does consciousness come from? As she was sharing her mystical experience that came through meditation. And she said, oh, the guy you need to ask that is Mark Gober. I said, awesome. So Mark, as our listeners heard in the intro, is the author of An End to Upside Down Thinking, Dispelling the Myth that the Brain Produces Consciousness and the Implications for Everyday Life. So I have to tell the listeners how much I enjoyed the book. I travel a lot, and I listen to a lot of books on Audible. I rarely read a whole book, but this book I read in like a day and a half. I couldn't put it down. There's a lot of mind flips as you read it where you want to pause and say, now hold it, what? But it really resonated with me, and as I'm sure Mark will share his different stories, there are some people that just can't accept this, and there are others that perhaps like myself that were like, it was validation of what we've sensed for a while. So Mark, I guess tell us your mind flipping story, how you came to write the book.
Yeah, that's a good mind flipping story. That's kind of the genesis of the book, really.
Yeah.
My background is in business. I'm a partner at a firm called Sherpa Technology Group, and I've been there for 9 years. Prior to that, I worked in investment banking in New York. So my background on the surface has nothing to do with consciousness. And it's usually the first question people ask me is, wait, how did you end up writing a book on consciousness and the nature of existence? And it started for me in terms of a mind flip in August of 2016 when I first heard a podcast. It was an interview on Extreme Health Radio. A woman was interviewed named Laura Powers, who talked about psychic abilities and anomalies of consciousness that I had never heard about before, beyond maybe science fiction. I'd never heard a person claim to have these experiences all the time. And at the end of that episode, Laura mentioned her own podcast called Healing Powers, where she interviews other people that have had similar experiences. So I decided to listen to that podcast just out of interest because I was somewhat intrigued from the earlier one. I didn't have a mind flip at that moment at all.
Okay. Yeah.
But after listening to all of the episodes on her podcast from 2016 back to 2011, I started to have a mind flip where I was wondering how it could be the case that so many people were speaking of this picture of reality where consciousness isn't just stuck in our brains, that I really began to question my old paradigm, which is the conventional paradigm in science, which says that the reason that we are all conscious is solely due to stuff happening in our skull. So that podcast started me on the research path, and the research path was both intellectual and academic, where I was reading scientific papers and watching YouTube videos of scientists. But also I started to work and engage with people that claimed to have these abilities. And sure enough, they were able to do things with me over the phone that I couldn't explain, but which the research was kind of backing up. So it was a gradual mind flip, I would say. It was started in August of 2016, and it's probably still going on now, where I used to think that the conventional view of reality, which is that everything's just can be reduced to matter, including, the source of our consciousness, to instead saying, no, consciousness is the basis of all reality, and the physical world is just within consciousness. That's the ongoing mind flip for me.
So cool. That's so cool. So I've since reading your book, I've checked out Healing Powers podcast. It's still out there. And Extreme Health, was that the original one?
Yeah.
You heard her? Yeah. Very cool. We'll try to put those links in the show notes at mindflipping.com. And I have to say that question that I proposed to Dr. Chan, Dr. Edith, of where does consciousness come from, came into my mind after listening to Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, and it's about psychedelics. And so as a lot of our listeners are hypnotists, hypnotherapists, in other healing, helping fields, coaching, meditation, it's, I can say for myself, we got caught up in the fact that all things happen up here in our brain, and if we can change the reality in the brain, we can change our own reality. And yet, what if the brain or consciousness or mind isn't there? And it's something in that book, in Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, he just talked about from these mystical experiences through psychedelics that there is a tapping into this external or outside our brain or body consciousness, which is fascinating. So go ahead, if you can continue a little bit about your book and the different chapters and how you did the research to kind of prove, and I had never heard the word materialist viewpoint and what that means. And
yes, so materialism is also something that I had never heard of explicitly, but now I realize that this was my old worldview, and it's the worldview held by most of science today, which says the following, basically. This is just a summary, that the universe started 13.8 billion years ago through some event that we don't fully understand called the Big Bang, and it filled the universe with physical material that we call matter. So if I touch my chair is made out of atoms of matter. So by matter, I mean solid material. In a big universe, you have lots of atoms all over the place, and chance tells us that atoms will start to interact with each other because the universe is so big. And when that happens, we end up with reactions that we call chemistry. So we started with matter, now we have chemistry. With enough random chemical reactions in a huge universe, chance tells us that we will end up with a molecule structured in a way that it can replicate itself. And that's like DNA. So DNA leads to the evolution of biological species like a human being. The human being evolves to have a brain, and from the brain comes out this thing that we call consciousness, our subjective inner experience or awareness that we all have. And that's the conventional view of reality. Matter creates consciousness through a brain. You were talking about Michael Pollan's book, which I think is a great book because it's a step in this direction of trying to understand consciousness. But there's still, I think, even within the field of psychedelics, a belief I sometimes hear, which is that, well, the psychedelics are activating things in the brain and therefore are creating the experience.
Sure.
Now, this is the potential error with the materialist perspective, which is saying that, well, because the brain is changing and therefore we see conscious changes in consciousness, we're seeing a strong correlation between what happens to the brain and what happens to consciousness. And this can happen with brain damage in the same way, where someone gets in a car accident and maybe they have memory loss afterwards. So we have this very clear connection where we change the brain in a certain way and consciousness shifts. So why isn't that not sufficient to then say, well, the brain must produce consciousness? And the error in statistics is known as correlation does not imply causation. So just because two things are related does not automatically mean that one causes the other. It could, but it's not guaranteed.
Right.
So, to give an analogy that I use in the book from Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, a philosopher, he says, imagine that you have a fire and you have lots of firefighters that appear to put out the fire. And then let's say you have a larger fire and even more firefighters show up. If we look at the correlation there, there's a strong correlation between the size of the fire and the number of firefighters. But the firefighters aren't causing the fire. There's another explanation to demonstrate why the two things are connected. So that's what I'm exploring in the book. I'm saying, well, maybe correlation is not causation here. Maybe the brain is related to consciousness in the same way that an antenna receiver is picking up a signal for a TV. So when you watch a TV show, what appears on your screen comes from the signal that's outside the set. The TV antenna is the processor or the filtering mechanism or the receiver. Maybe the brain and the body are acting in that capacity for consciousness. So that's the general idea that I explore in the book. And the way that I tackle it is to look at a number of anomalies. When I say anomalies, I mean things that don't necessarily fit under the materialist view that the consciousness comes from the brain. And there are two broad categories within which there are many sub issues that I look at. One is psychic phenomena. So I look at things like remote viewing, the idea that you can perceive something when you're not there physically, telepathy, mind-to-mind communication, precognition, which is knowing or sensing the future before it happens. And I look at that in animals as well, and some of these psychic abilities with animals. Psychokinesis, which is the ability for the mind to impact physical matter, even if it's very subtle. And that's kind of the psychic bucket. The other bucket is surviving bodily death, the notion that when the body dies, consciousness doesn't cease to function. And I look at near-death experiences, I look at communications with the deceased, and children who have alleged memories of a previous life, and this comes from research at the University of Virginia. So all of these things together point toward a form of consciousness that's not stuck in our skull and perhaps even survives bodily death.
Wild. I love it. And so a couple of things to add to that. On a personal level, as I was reading the book, I was thinking about, and as I finished it, I haven't told many people this. I haven't told Mark that you're probably in the top 3 or 4 books that I love, that I've read, that have an impact, and I think it resonates with me. So probably the first one was The Power of Positive Thinking, and there's actually a lot in there about using our mind to influence other things. The second one was a Return to Love by Marianne Williamson, and the third was The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. And I know you have a little bit of a connection with that one, right? Your publisher, or
We have the same literary agent.
Literary agent. Very cool. And this one, they all come back to a similar truth. And it was a truth that on a personal level meant something for me. So my dad passed in 77. I was 13, he was 41. And I didn't know at the time, but a book that you talk about, 1975, Moody, is that the author? Life After Life?
Life After Life. Mm-hmm.
Life After Life helped me with my dad's death, because it was a book about people that had near-death experiences, right? And since then, there are NDEs, as they call them, near-death experiencers. They have conventions, and I've gone on the computer and saved a document of the messages that they got from their near-death experience, because it's such a comforting thought that we don't die, that this is just one way to tap into consciousness through our body. So I think that all of that is why your book really resonated with me. And I love your antenna. I think that makes sense. You talk about, I forget who it was, use the description of the river and the whirlpools. You want to touch on that?
Yeah, that's a really helpful analogy.
Yeah.
When people ask me to explain the general theory, this is really it. And it again comes from Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, who, by the way, wrote a book called Why Materialism is Baloney. So he is also challenging this materialist perspective. He uses more philosophy in his books. He touches on the science, whereas my book is more of the science and just kind of touches on the philosophy.
Okay.
But he says, imagine that all of reality is like a stream of water, where water is like consciousness. Each of us is a whirlpool within that stream, meaning we have boundaries. So it seems like we're having a localized personal experience, but we're fundamentally connected as part of the broader stream. And this is an important way to think about the model, because this would predict 2 general categories of phenomena. One, if some of the water from my whirlpool gets into another person's whirlpool, that would be like some of my consciousness entering that person's consciousness. That's like a telepathic or a psychic ability. So this model would predict that psychic abilities are not anomalous. They are not paranormal. They're what you would predict to be true. So that's critical. They're only anomalous if you assume materialism.
Right.
In that the brain produces the brain produces consciousness, and that consciousness can't leave the skull.
Right.
The other prediction is that, let's just say one of the whirlpools stops being a whirlpool, it delocalizes. That means the water just changes form. It doesn't leave the stream, it transitions into something else. So this model would predict that consciousness survives when the body dies. That's critical. Again, surviving bodily death under this framework is not anomalous. It's not paranormal. It's what you would predict.
That's what you'd predict. Yeah. So you touch in the book a little bit about, especially with children, tapping into past lives. Back in episode 72 of the Mind Flipping podcast, a few episodes back, I interviewed Martin Castor-Peterson. Martin's a friend, and he was introduced to hypnosis through his initial session was a past life regression. And our listeners can check into that. But he had a vivid and profound past life regression through a hypnotic session that he wrote about and then verified months later, and had another tie-in from somebody else. So can you touch on your explanation for that, some of the research that's been done around that?
Well, going back to the stream
Yeah.
analogy, it's sort of like where you have one whirlpool, the whirlpool stops being a whirlpool, the water dissolves, and then maybe it reconfigures into a new whirlpool with different water or something like that. So
Sure.
this model of reality would predict that reincarnation is not out there at all. It's definitely within the realm of possibility. In terms of the evidence that I focus on in the book, I focus on research from the University of Virginia that's been conducted for over 50 years, over 2,500 cases of young children, usually between the ages of 2 and 5 in that neighborhood, who have vivid memories of a previous life. And in some distinct cases, the researchers are able to find the person that matches the description that the little kid is giving. And sometimes that person's far away, and it would have been virtually impossible for the child to have known some of the details that they later find out. To me, the strongest cases are the ones where children have physical manifestations that align with the previous life,
Yeah.
where they have a birthmark or a physical deformity that matches how they describe dying in the previous life, and where the researchers sometimes can find medical records to validate that this happened to another person. So those cases, I think, are very difficult to explain under a conventional paradigm of reality, but we can explain it by shifting our view on consciousness. With regard to hypnosis, it's not something I focus on in the book quite as much because this topic is so controversial that I wanted to stick with the strongest evidence that's been done the most, and there have been the most replications and has been looked at very, very closely. Hypnosis has been looked at by some scientists, but what I hear from the researchers is that it's much less reliable, that there are some cases that people cannot explain at all through conventional means, even including things like what's known as xenoglossy, X-E-N-O. It's the ability to speak a language that you've never been taught. So things like that are sometimes reported with children, in rare cases also with adults under hypnosis.
Yep.
But it's less reliable. So sometimes the imagination can kick in, and it's hard to know, is it imagination or not under hypnosis? So I think it's in an area that probably needs to be explored. It just didn't make the cut for this book because I had to really keep it tight in terms of, because I knew that there would be skeptics that would want to poke holes in everything. So I picked the research that's been conducted the most thoroughly.
Yeah. And so what the book did for me, because my primary occupation is as a hypnotist and coach, I say, I'll use hypnotic processes and coaching people to help change our lives. And so there's a little bit of validation. A lot of us in the hypnosis field are familiar with the term critical factor, critical faculty, or critical function. And whether it's the river analogy or the antenna, and even when we tie back into these to younger kids, it seems like, well, the theory in hypnosis is, and there are many theories, is that like meditation, hypnotic state bypasses what's called that critical faculty, that conscious, logical, analytical part of our mind, and gets to what we often call the deeper part of our mind, or subconscious. But I see it now, and reading your book is it increases the power of the antenna. It moves away the clouds, if you will, and allows the client in hypnosis or the meditator, like in the case of Dr. Edith, to tap into that higher consciousness, whatever we want to call it. And
Yes.
And so that's what happens, and again, there's theory, there's research. My theory on past lives is, while Martin or whoever may not have lived that life or may not be reincarnated, maybe they are, who knows, they are tapping into an awareness that most of us can't tap into, if we use that antenna analogy. And I think that what makes sense for me in the book is that younger kids haven't learned that this isn't acceptable. Their antenna is still on, is high, the clouds are not there. Yeah. And as we grow and learn and get that analytical, critical part of our mind, and our prefrontal cortex develops, we think, well, that's not possible.
Yeah, an analogy I like to use also is to say that consciousness is like the sun, and clouds in the sky block rays of the sun. And as we get older, with conditioning and different emotions and thoughts, we end up actually increasing the number of clouds that are blocking pure consciousness. Whereas a child might have fewer obstructions. The clouds haven't formed yet. So maybe there are more memories with children because of that. And hypnosis might be one tactic to remove some of the clouds. And I am completely open to the idea that hypnosis can be used to access previous lives, for sure. I think it just has to be maybe studied a bit more to show when it's actually a previous life, when it's an imagination. But to me, it's about whether or not it's effective to the client, at least in that setting. If it's effective to the client to get over a fear or some mental obstruction, then it's worth it.
Yep. And that was Martin's message in the podcast. I asked him about that. How do you explain it? And his message was, I can't explain it, but what's more important is it beneficial? Is it advantageous? Has it been advantageous? And, my theory, again, just my theory, there are listeners have other ones, that hypnosis and meditation are two sides of the same coin. They're very similar. And when you hear like Dr. Edith's and other people, Michael Singer, I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Singer, The Untethered Soul, he had many meditative experiences that are hard to explain, the yogis and all of them. And so meditation, hypnosis, whatever it is, we are, as you say, perhaps removing those clouds.
Yeah. You reminded me of a story that I first heard on Healing Powers podcast. A woman named, I think her name's Myra Kelly, who was a corporate attorney in New York and started to develop really bad TMJ issues with her jaw. She saw a top dentist, I believe from Columbia, and they said, look, you're going to have your jaw operated on. She heard about past life regression hypnosis, and she didn't want to have the surgery. So she, as a last resort, decided to try it. And I believe the first time she tried hypnosis, nothing happened. She tried it again, and she had a flashback to being a slave where she had a chain around her neck and it was rubbing up against her jaw in the exact area where she had the TMJ pain in this life. And after she had that hypnosis experience, it was just kind of a flash, the TMJ pain went away.
That's so cool.
And the dentist couldn't explain it. And then she changed her career to becoming a past life regression hypnotherapist.
Wow, that's so cool. Very cool. So you said something else that popped up, a question that's floated out. Maybe it was related to one of the things I recognized as I read that I didn't see in the book. I think I heard you on some of your other podcasts, is channeling. How do you fit channeling into this? Am I right? It doesn't come up in the book a whole lot?
No, I talk about trance mediumship.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I use the word channeling. I might not use it.
Sure.
But it's something that I've looked at a lot. And trance mediumship is essentially the same thing, where it's going into a certain state of consciousness where basically a foreign form of consciousness, or let's say something from outside of your whirlpool is speaking through you.
Yeah. And
certain mediums do this, and certain people who just channel, they'll channel entities. And this, I've seen people do it. I have my own podcast that's coming out later in 2019. I've interviewed people that channel. It's very possible under this framework for the same reasons. It's sort of like accessing rays of consciousness by removing certain clouds, and maybe certain people have more attunement to be able to do that, where their antenna is almost able to switch stations more easily. And that's actually an analogy that Paul Selig gave me. He's one of the more popular channels today. He has guides that speak through him, and your listeners can go onto YouTube and watch him do it. It's like basically he hears it, so it's auditory, and then he mumbles what he hears and then repeats it more slowly so that you can hear it. And he describes it as kind of tuning into a different station.
Wild. And again, the majority of our population won't believe it, doesn't want to believe it, because it doesn't fit into our materialistic view. And you talk about that in the book, how, if all of this research has been around for so long, and it's been decades and even going into centuries, right? Back in the 18th century. Yeah. Some research, which we can talk about in a little bit. It's like, why isn't this out there? Well, there is a hushing of it, on a number of levels. Martin Peterson, who shared on this podcast and in other areas his past life experience, gets it as well, where he'll go to some conferences and they don't want him to talk about it. And I, admittedly, you're in, I think you're going to be episode 78, if my memory is right. And prior to Martin, I haven't talked about this aspect. And there's a little bit of a fear, losing credibility. But I think it is more truth than the other way. So I don't know if you want to touch on that, how it is difficult to get the word out, and maybe any of your experiences since your book has been published about, the hogwash that this may be, and others' minds.
Well, it's an issue that I touch on in the book, because I think it's one of the first questions that someone would ask who is new to the space, which is, wait a second, if this paradigm is real, consciousness isn't from the brain, why didn't I know about it? I was educated and I go on Wikipedia and Wikipedia says it's all bogus. How could it be true? And there are, I think, a number of, I don't know, it's like a sociological question almost. I mentioned Brian Josephson in the book as one example. He's a Nobel Prize winning physicist from Cambridge. He has taken an interest into psychic phenomena and has even said things like he thinks that telepathy is real and that quantum physics can help us explain it. And quantum physics is another area that I touch on in the book. He was uninvited from a scientific conference when they found out that he had these interests, and they said it wouldn't be appropriate for someone with your interests in the paranormal to attend a scientific conference.
Wow.
Nobel Prize winner is not exempt from this.
Wow.
And that kind of, I think that probably acts as a hindrance for certain people who say, well, maybe I believe in these things, but I just don't want to speak about it. And I don't want to be blasted on the internet or on the blogs or on Wikipedia. And it's actually, Wikipedia is something I talk about in the book and on my podcast. It's something I discuss with the scientists, where apparently there are groups that take over Wikipedia pages and make it impossible to edit. So you go on, let's say you read about a person in my book, you Google their name, you see that, oh, they're pseudoscience. That's what Wikipedia says. And if you don't have time to evaluate that claim, you probably think, well, there's a reason that Wikipedia is saying it's pseudoscience because it must be the case.
Yeah.
So there's this, like, it's fighting against that. It's really like a propaganda almost.
An agenda. Yeah.
Yeah. It feels like an agenda, and it doesn't feel objective. It feels just very biased. So that's part of what I wanted to do in the book, was to take hopefully an objective stance and just put all the evidence in one place and say, can one shoot all this evidence down? And the way I frame the book is, if we look at all of those phenomena that I mentioned, all the different types of psychic phenomena and evidence for surviving bodily death, if even one of those things is actually real, we have to question the paradigm, the unproven paradigm that the brain produces consciousness. And I should add that Science Magazine has called this the number 2 question that remains in all of science. How is it that the brain could ever produce something that's non-physical? The brain's physical, consciousness isn't. So we have mainstream science acknowledges how big a question this is. So I personally think we should be starting from that point to say, wait a second, we have no idea how the brain produces consciousness. It's logically possible that the brain isn't producing it at all. So from my standpoint, I feel comfortable putting a book out like this because I'm relying on science. And if someone wants to combat it, I would say, explain to me why the studies are fallacious, or why there's delusion, or why they used bad scientific methods.
And where's the science that proves otherwise?
Where's the science that proves otherwise? And I just haven't seen it. I think it becomes a very flimsy argument within any of the chapters. I think each of them there are strong cases to be made. So when you put them all together, it's an analogy that I use from Dr. Jeff Mishlove, who says when you have an individual twig, you can easily break it. But when you put those twigs together into a bundle, it becomes very difficult to break the bundle. And that's kind of where I am. I got to the point where the bundle's too big. I can't break it with what I've seen. And therefore, if I want to be intellectually honest, I have to shift my paradigm.
Yeah. As you're talking about that, my mind flashed to, I mentioned the book by Marianne Williamson, A Return to Love, which is a summary of A Course in Miracles, which in many ways was a channeled writing. Growing up Christian, I had trouble. I loved the message of A Course in Miracles and A Return to Love. But I had trouble figuring out how could this have happened. And so if consciousness is there, and channeling occurs, there was a truth that came through, the same truth that came through Jesus, came through this woman, I forget her name, who wrote these inspired words of A Course in Miracles. So a lot of these things that we didn't have an explanation for, I don't know, the puzzle pieces kind of fall into place with all the research that you've shared. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think we have to rethink what in the past we've called prophecy or mystical experiences that religions have talked about for a long time with this lens of consciousness, what was actually happening in those events. And now when we evaluate people who channel, and there are institutes that actually study this, like the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Northern California, they're studying phenomena like channeling. If we can understand what it is, then we might be able to understand what's happened in the past, but also what comes through in channeling, whether it's the Course in Miracles or Paul Selig or others, are perspectives on the nature of reality. So that to me is really interesting. What are these entities, these supposed entities, bringing forth through a personal body. And I think there's a flip side of that as well. On the topic of mind flipping, there tends to be an assumption, I think, or there's a real draw to thinking that what's coming through when information is being channeled must be some higher information. But I think in the same way that on Earth we have people that are doing really good things and other people that are doing more malevolent things, it's possible that what's coming through in some cases is not positive or beneficial. So I think we have to be discerning in what information comes through a channel even. And so there is this tendency to say, wow, this is like amazing information. It seems like it's so high powered, but could there be manipulation in certain channels?
Sure.
What kind of entities are coming through? So that's a whole other area of research that probably needs to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point. So of the research that you did and you, can you summarize, was it 6, 7, 8 different areas that I know you said there were 2 general groups.
2 general groups. And then, so remote viewing, telepathy, precognition, animals with these abilities, psychokinesis, near-death experiences, communications with the deceased, and children with past life memories. Those are the different categories.
So of those, do you have a favorite research finding studies in 1, 2, or 3 of them that are like just kind of blew you away?
Remote viewing, which is the first one I start with, and this is the ability to perceive something that's far away. So in theory, I'm sitting here in California, I could close my eyes, go into a trance or hypnotic meditative state, and draw for you what is in some location in China that I've never seen before and do it accurately. That's remote viewing. And
the other thing we haven't brought up is beyond space and time.
Yes.
The remote viewing.
That's a great point. So what I'm arguing about consciousness, and when I say I'm arguing, I'm really summarizing what other people have been saying for a long time, is that not only is consciousness the primary aspect of reality, it's the stream, but it exists beyond all space and time. And therefore, it would at least be conceivable that through our consciousness, we can access things that seem far away in space and seem far away temporally, whether in the future or in the past. It's a mind-blowing idea, but
it's definitely a mind flip.
It's a mind flip. We see this with remote viewing, where people are able to do this. And it's been studied at Princeton University. There was a lab for nearly 30 years run by the former dean of engineering, where they ran trials on remote viewers. And they did it independent of time as well, where they would have someone remote view a location where a person would be in the future, draw it out, and people were able to do it with beyond chance accuracy. The US government ran a program for more than 20 years where they were using remote viewers for national security purposes. They were basically using psychic spies. And there are some remarkable cases. And one example is former US President Jimmy Carter confirmed that remote viewers were used to find a downed Russian bomber that was lost in an African jungle. There's actually a new documentary that came out. It's called Third Eye Spies, and it was produced by Russell Targ, one of the laser physicists who ran the program from the Stanford Research Institute, ran the government program in the 70s and 80s. And the documentary starts with Jimmy Carter uttering those words, that it was the one thing in his presidency that he couldn't explain. No one knew where this bomber was. The radar systems couldn't find it, and remote viewers were able to do this from a distant location. And there are many cases of this. So that one it's one of the more difficult things to actually believe. But then I found declassified CIA documents that say explicitly, direct quote, remote viewing is a real phenomenon. Implications are revolutionary. And they show a scientific panel that examined it. These are in the declassified documents. And they say the evidence is too impressive to dismiss as mere coincidence.
I mean, that alone, that's enough. It's like, and then you have all these other things.
That's how I feel. I mean, I could just look at that one document, remote viewing is a real phenomenon.
Yep.
That's super compelling.
Right.
And it's interesting for me to speak with people who have been in this space, like Russell Targ, who also I interviewed for my podcast. For someone like him who saw this on a daily basis, there's no question. It's not even like, well, maybe psychic abilities are real. To say anything otherwise to him is outrageous. That's the vibe I got.
Wow.
And it's interesting to hear that perspective versus some of the people that I mentioned in my book, really smart scientists who say there is no evidence for extrasensory perception.
Yeah, it's crazy. The dichotomy. Wow. And then some of the remote viewing that you talk about, I think is fascinating. In fact, I was sharing this with some friends and family, that the accuracy of it and how it happened, what they saw didn't happen yet. It happened in the future. And then when it happened in the future, it was as they had seen.
Yes. Yes, so it's a form of precognitive remote viewing.
Yeah.
So it's seeing the future before it happens and being able to draw it out. And these were some of the trials that were done at Princeton, but Russell Targ described some studies that were done at the Stanford Research Institute too, where they were testing it out. And they would say, hey, I want you to draw this target where someone is going to be, but you don't know where that is. And then they are able to do it accurately. And in fact, Dr. Jessica Utz, who was the 2016 president of the American Statistics Association, so a very credible person to evaluate whether things are happening beyond chance. She was asked by the CIA and by U.S. Congress in 1995 to evaluate all this evidence. And she says, this is a direct quote, in her publicly available report, she says, using the standards applied to any other area of science, psychic functioning has been well established. She also mentions, and this is why I mentioned her, she says that precognition seems to work quite well. And this is this idea of precognitive remote viewing in many cases, where people are seeing a distant location before the event has happened. So again, it's consciousness acting beyond space and time.
So cool. So beyond space, you talked about the abilities in animals in a study where they had cameras on dogs and owners. You want to touch on that?
These were studies done by Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. And I should say that we don't have as much evidence in the domain of animals, and largely because of funding. That's the big issue in all of this, is that we would have way more research if research dollars were going into this area. And for many reasons. One, I think I've heard that funders sometimes are almost embarrassed to put their name on this kind of research, because then it says that they're interested in psychic stuff.
Right.
But also it's not a priority. There are other things that seem to be more important. So the area of animals and psychic abilities, that's like way below everything else. But Rupert Sheldrake is one researcher who's looked at this very closely, a former Cambridge biochemist. And there have been pairs of dogs and owners that seem to have some kind of a entanglement in the way that they're thinking about things. And he talks about a woman named Pam and her dog JT, where Rupert Sheldrake would send Pam away, miles away in a cab at a random time. So he controlled for all the factors that you might think, well, maybe the dog was smelling or sensing or something. And he was looking at the dog's behavior about whether the dog acted differently when Pam was on her way home. And what Pam had been claiming, and I think this is the reason that Dr. Sheldrake ended up studying this dog owner pair, is that the dog seemed to know when she was coming home. So he had cameras on the dog, cameras on Pam. Again, she's taken away, miles away in a cab, not even her own car. She doesn't even know when she's coming home. She is with one of the experimenters who gets a text message saying, okay, now it's time to come home. As she starts walking to the cab, you see the dog walk to the window. And this happens more times. If you look at the statistics, it's beyond chance. And if your listeners are interested, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake has a video of this. It's a 5-minute video showing the experimental design. And you have a camera on the dog, the camera on Pam. And you see when she's deciding to go home, she's walking to the cab, the dog starts walking to the window.
Crazy. Wow. Then again, that fit into my realm of possibility, as crazy as it is, as much of a mind flip as it is. I have a friend locally here in the Milwaukee area, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that your book inspired me. I gotta get her on. We're gonna scare everybody away from the podcast. So Stacy is she's a medium and an animal communicator, and those two words, a lot of people will shake their head, but I've had sessions with her, and she again shared information there was just no way that she could know, and she regularly gets together and communicates with pets, including pets that have passed on for their owners, and shares information about favorite things that the pet liked to do, how the pet would ride in the car, or the favorite treat. It's like she's tapping into that stream. There's no other way of explaining it. It's just so cool.
Yeah, I mean, I view the body as sort of as like a vehicle for consciousness, and so it's totally conceivable that an animal is just a different type of vehicle for having an experience. But I think on the point of psychics and those who claim to be able to communicate with the deceased or animals or other entities, it's important to remember that what we're looking at here is whether or not these people can bring through information that's beyond what chance would predict.
Sure.
Not whether they're 100% accurate.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the big misunderstandings, where a psychic is put on the stand and they're wrong on something.
Right.
That doesn't mean that all psychics are wrong all the time. It just means in that one trial they were not correct. What the statistics show is that something is happening beyond chance, and this happens over and over again.
Yeah, and you do a great job in the book of laying that out. The odds beyond chance are infinitesimal. That it couldn't be chance.
Yeah, and actually, Dr. Dean Radin from the Institute of Noetic Sciences, he also had affiliations with the U.S. government in Princeton, has been studying this stuff for over 40 years. I think he's one of the smartest people in this space, and at some point, hopefully in the future, he'll be acknowledged for his work. But he has combined the best evidence for these statistical phenomena: remote viewing, telepathy, precognition, psychokinesis, mind affecting matter. And he looks at the studies, and they are all at the level of what's known as 6 sigma. And in statistics, that means that the odds that those are just chance occurrences over the many trials run is more than 1 billion to 1. So when we look in other areas of science, 1 billion.
Yeah.
The Higgs boson particle, which won the Nobel Prize in physics, a major finding, that was roughly a 5 sigma statistical result.
Wow.
And here we have 6 sigma results in multiple areas of revolutionary science, and it's being unacknowledged by most of the scientific community and most of society.
Wow, that's a great comparison. Thanks for bringing that up. Wow, very cool. So a couple of other things that are floating in my head that I wanted to bring up, and I don't even remember why I wanted to bring it up. I'm going to bring up a name, Spira?
Rupert Spira.
Rupert Spira. There was a couple of things that he said that really resonated with me. Page 234.
He's quoted heavily at the end of the book.
Yeah. Any idea, like, what's his, what I might be?
Well, he's very much of this perspective, which is sometimes known as non-duality, which is that there's one reality and that we're all kind of expressions of that one reality. We're all part of the same stream. So there's an analogy of the television screen. Is that the one you're thinking of?
No, actually, I just saw his explanation for love and beauty.
Okay. Yeah. So these are love and beauty are open questions in the realm of evolutionary psychology. And I remember this because I studied psychology in undergrad. And the kind of the lens that we would take on everything is, why is this behavior selected for? In other words, is this behavior advantageous for the survival of the genes?
Yeah.
And that I think is an appropriate lens in some cases. There are some issues, though, that I didn't personally understand and that are open questions in psychology. Love and beauty are 2 of them. Lust makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary standpoint, because to procreate will give the genes another chance to survive. So that makes complete sense. Right. Love is not as clear cut. I mean, we can make some arguments, theoretical arguments, that love enables the survival of the species because you're caring for one another. Maybe that's part of it, but there might be another explanation that is deeper, which is that basically love is the recognition of our shared being in another person. Whereas beauty, and that's an even harder one to explain with evolution, like, why is it that we find a sunset so beautiful? Do we need that to survive and pass on genes? I really have had a hard time thinking about beauty from that lens. But if we think about it from this consciousness-centric lens, and as Spira puts it, beauty is the recognition of our shared being in an object, whereas love is the recognition of our shared being in another entity, whether it's an animal or a human or some kind of living thing.
I love that. Yeah. So similar, love and beauty, being versus object. Yeah. And that is a good question. As you're feeling those feelings of connection to a sunset, to a leaf, to the sound of a bird, even to something man-made, I think I don't know. When I read that, it resonated with me.
Yeah. I've heard that from a number of people.
Cool.
Yeah.
And then similarly, I think it was maybe on 237, you talked about something that Dr. Greenwell has focused her life's work on helping people who have had awakening experiences, and like she experienced. And then you said something about these awakenings involve a primal Kundalini energy theorized to exist at the base of the spine, which made me think about, I don't know if you've heard of I think I might be getting his name wrong, Dr. Michael Cotton, Higher Brain Living. So this is a guy, a chiropractor, I think, by profession. He had a process where he would stimulate in some way the base of the spine of people laying on their stomach, and they would begin to undulate. Have you heard of any of this?
Well, in awakening experiences, there's sometimes physical gyrations that I've heard about.
Okay. So our listeners might know what I'm talking about. I don't have any more than that, but that struck me because I could never explain what I saw. There were public demonstrations, including somebody that I know. And I used to think that it was a trained behavior. It was a hypnotic process. But if there is something and energetically at the base of the spine, there may be more to it.
Yeah, I wonder if it's related. I don't know enough about that in particular,
Sure.
but I do hear of these awakening experiences, and Dr. Edith had one herself, where it's kind of this sense of oneness, and it's in many cases a very blissful experience. Eckhart Tolle experienced one, and there are many. It's happening more and more. Sometimes they're called Kundalini awakenings, where there's this immense energy, which has been talked about in Eastern traditions for a long time, and maybe that's what's happening in some of these cases.
Could be. Yeah. And speaking of Eastern traditions, you mentioned something earlier as when I said how difficult it is to talk about this, to get published, to get funding, that it seems to be a social, there's a social aspect to it. And yet there are many cultures that don't have the same limitations that we do, through the years and even presently that, this is just known and accepted.
I think in the West, there's a bias against these things because that's just the way culture and education really are set up. But in the East, these ideas have been around for a long time. But also in the mystical traditions in the West, like Kabbalah and Judaism, or Gnosticism and Christianity, Sufism and Islam, they kind of talk about very similar ideas of where consciousness is the basis of everything and that we're interconnected. But I think there is a cultural bias, and that's part of the problem we're having. You're reminding me of a few comments I heard from people that I interviewed who will try to publish papers in this area where they'll get a scientific finding and they'll submit the paper to a journal. And in some cases, they tell me that the journal will reject the paper on the basis of the fact that the findings are impossible. Not that the methodology is wrong, but that, no, this cannot be true, and therefore we're not publishing it.
So ignoring the whole process, everything, what they found, it's not possible. Crazy.
That's what we're dealing with.
Wow, crazy. Wow. All right. Well, let's hop into the lighten up round. We're going to change it up. No longer the speckle round. It's the lighten up round. And so I want to respect your time. We're going to get just a few questions in here. And among the questions for the lighten up round are, do you have a word or phrase of the day that you want to share, Mark?
I like the quote from Erwin Schrödinger, the Nobel Prize winning physicist. He said, "In truth, there's only one mind."
Ooh, in truth, there's only one mind.
Mm-hmm.
So what else can you tell us about this guy?
Well, he's most known for examining quantum physics, and he's one of the revolutionary thinkers from decades ago. And so for him, someone like him to be talking about one mind, which is this one stream of consciousness, that's, to me, very powerful. And even, in fact, Dr. Larry Dossey, someone else who studies these topics, he wrote a book called One Mind on this very topic.
Awesome. In truth, there's only one mind.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I think that's a mic drop. We'll we'll wrap it up there. But before we do officially wrap things up, do you have a request for our listeners? I know you've got a podcast coming up. Anything else you'd like to point them to, offer words of wisdom, anything else?
I think if your listeners enjoyed this conversation, I think the podcast will be of interest because you get to hear from the scientists and practitioners that I mentioned in the book. And I'll be announcing the formal launch date and the podcast name and where to find it and all that through my mailing list and my website. So my name, markgober.com, is my website. Also on social media. So I think that's probably the place to start. But in terms of closing messages, what you and I have been speaking about today is really a matter of recontextualizing identity. So I want to leave on that note because my perspective on reality, the materialist perspective, says that we are a body that has a consciousness, but we're a body first and foremost. This alternative paradigm where consciousness is fundamental, and to quote Max Planck, another Nobel Prize winning physicist, in 1931, he said, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness." Okay, so that's true. Back in 1931, right?
31, yeah.
That means our identity is our consciousness, and we're experiencing the physical world through a body. So I think there's something to a practice of aligning with that identity as our consciousness, as the awareness that all of us has at this exact instant, to say, wait a second, that which is aware of this conversation, is the basis of identity. And it's like, it's always been there, whether we've acknowledged it or not. But there's something to awakening that awareness that's been there and kind of aligning with it as a witness, which I think can be a very profound thing for people. And it's something that you can do at any point in time. It's actually something Rupert Spira always talks about. It's like, this is accessible at all times, but we're conditioned by society and also by what our eyes show us to think that we're a body and that we have a consciousness and that there's a world out there that is totally independent of our awareness.
Yeah, and as you, I think, allude to in the book, or maybe I heard in some of your interviews, you wrote the book in response to your findings and your sharing of findings with friends and family, people you talk to, and how it was changing their lives. And I think it is, as you allude to there, when we allow ourselves to shift our perceptions, our sense of identity, it is in many ways freeing and enlightening and life-changing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I found for me, certainly. And then for people that I talked about, I talked to these topics about, and then also people that have started to read the book, I've heard that same feedback where it's like an opening of the door, like just a little bit. And once the door is open, a lot of things can start to happen. It's like all of a sudden now you have this huge body of evidence that you have to think about when you think about any phenomenon in life. It's like, well, maybe it's this conventional perspective, but wait, how would it fit into the stream and consciousness and non-local phenomenon, consciousness beyond space and time? Could it fit into that? And the minute that you have this alternative paradigm, I think it's the beginning of the end for the new, for the old way of thinking.
Yeah.
At least that's the way it's been for me. So I think just being exposed to this information can be extremely profound. However, it can take time to adjust to it. And that's something I should mention. It was not overnight for me. It's still ongoing. And so for your listeners who are maybe newer to these particular topics, it can take time to adjust to it because it's disorienting at first.
It's a great way to put it. Yeah. And so lastly, I do, if it's not obvious already, highly recommend the book. We've just touched on the research that you share in there, the argument to look at life and our perceptions and exist in a different way. And it's fantastic. I can't recommend it enough.
Well, I really appreciate that. And I hope your listeners enjoy it. And thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thanks so much, Mark. Thanks for being here.